Good evening. My name's Andrew Clapham. I'm a professor here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. A very warm welcome to everybody this evening. We're extremely privileged to have with us tonight the Commissioner General of UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine and Refugees, Philippe Lazzarini. Welcome. Maybe before I introduce the speaker, I may say just a few words about UNRWA. Founded in 1949, its mandate for the Palestinians expelled or fleeing the violence of 1948 and the subsequent conflicts. The mandate covers Gaza as well, as we will hear, but also the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Palestinians in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. There are millions registered with UNRWA. The work of UNRWA covers education and healthcare. And as I was preparing these remarks this evening, I looked back to the UNRWA Resolution 302 from 1949 that founds UNRWA, the General Assembly. And I noticed that it mentions that there should be continued assistance for the relief of Palestine refugees is necessary to prevent conditions of starvation and distress amongst them and to further conditions of peace and stability. As you know, the hindering of UNRWA has clearly in the last few years been closely associated with the issue of starvation and indeed the distress in Gaza. Now, Mr. Lazzarini is a graduate of the University of Neuchâtel and the University of Lausanne. He's married with 4 children, 3 of whom are here tonight, and welcome Antonia, who's also here. He started his professional career in 1987 as an economist with the canton of Bern in Switzerland. From 1989 to 1999, Mr. Lazzarini worked with the International Committee of the Red Cross and as the deputy head of communications here in Geneva. He then went to the field as the head of delegation in Rwanda, Angola, and Sarajevo, having also worked as an ICRC delegate in southern Sudan, Jordan, Gaza, and Beirut. We then find a period of him working with the Union Bancaire Privée in Geneva as head of marketing development. He then goes on in 2003 to work for the United Nations in Iraq, obviously a key year in the history of Iraq. And since then, he's held a number of senior positions, both at headquarters in New York and in Angola, Somalia, and the occupied Palestinian territory. He worked for the United Nations Assistance Mission in Somalia as Deputy Special Representative, Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator from 2013 to 2015, and then served as Deputy UN Special Coordinator and Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for Lebanon. He was, in the end now, finally appointed as Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, by Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He took up his post on the 1st of April 2020. He will be leaving at the end of this week on the 31st of March 2026 after 6 very turbulent and I would imagine exasperating years. I'd like to salute his courage, his indomitable spirit and determination, and of course his ability to stand up for UNRWA and the Palestine refugees UNRWA is mandated to serve. Those of you watching Swiss TV last night, the TSR, will have heard him say that he is not going quietly into retirement. We can expect a book about his experience, and I'm sure there will be continuing contributions in multiple fields. So as you can see, we have someone with a broad range of increasing responsibility across Africa and the Middle East, as well as in entities as diverse as the Union Bancaire Privée, the ICRC, and now the UN. He's coming to the end of his mandate as Commissioner General of UNRWA and will reflect on the particular turbulent period that he and the staff of UNRWA, the refugees of Palestine, and of course others in the region have been going through. In particular, and perhaps this is relevant for this audience and because he's speaking at the Graduate Institute, he's chosen to talk about how international law is not only being violated, but this is done with impunity, and even those states that have historically been vocal in calling out human rights violations, violations of international humanitarian law, violations of UN immunity, have suddenly lost their voices. In turn, we face the disintegration of those rules, and the rules are weakened when nobody speaks out to condemn their violation. Tonight, I'm hoping that he has not come to bury the rules, but rather to urge us that we should not give up. The title of his talk is The War in Gaza, the Future of UNRWA and the Rules-Based Order. Mr. Commissioner General, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for the introduction. Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Geneva Graduate Institute and to address all of you at the end of my tenure, as you heard, as Commissioner General of UNRWA, the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Before the war in Gaza, not many people outside the United Nations and the Middle East were familiar with UNRWA, and despite its massive regional workforce of nearly 30,000 people, as you heard from Andrew, delivering education, primary health care, social services across the occupied Palestinian territory, but also in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Since October 23, however, UNRWA has become a bellwether for the changes sweeping across the Middle East and the multilateral system that has been in place since the end of World War II. The international commitment to human rights and international law, so painstakingly fostered over three-quarters of a century, is challenged today in ways that dangerously threaten a rule-based international order. Tonight, I want to share with you what it has been like to lead an organization on the front lines of the war in Gaza and under severe attack by the Israeli government and those who blindly support its objective of ending UNRWA. Let me start on October 7, 2023. I was at home when I received the news of the abhorrent attack on Israel. I think we all remember where we were and what we were doing that day. It is impossible to overstate the impact of these attacks and the brutal war on Gaza that followed. The attacks by Hamas on Israel triggered a deep collective and intergenerational trauma. The shock and horror of the massacres and abductions reverberated across Europe, North America, and elsewhere, polarizing societies on the Israel-Palestine conflict. The most intense bombardment of a civilian population since World War II followed, transforming Gaza into a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The war had been going on for almost 4 weeks. When I visited in Gaza in early November 2023, and at that time, I was the first senior UN official visiting the Strip. A total siege had been imposed, and nothing was entering the Strip. People lacked everything. I visited one of our schools in Rafah, sheltering thousands of displaced civilians. There, I met a young girl. She might have been 7 or 8 years old, the same age as my youngest child. She was sheltering the school in which she used to study. She stood in front of me, begging me for a sip of water and a piece of bread. The despair in her eyes still haunts me. But this was just the beginning of the war. Since then, Gaza has been reduced to rubble. Countless atrocities have been committed. People have been forced to move like pinballs, fleeing death and unable to bury or grieve their loved one. And then, a new law. Despite our outrage whenever famine occurs, our aspiration to prevent it, and despite repeated warnings from food security experts, the Israeli imposed a strict siege and did not allow food to enter into Gaza. Food was weaponized, and hunger spread and deepened to the extent that famine was declared for more than 500,000 people in Gaza City. A man-made famine. To add a layer of cruelty, thousands of starving people were forced to seek assistance at the infamous Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distribution site. They were nothing else than death traps. Nearly 2,000 hungry people were killed at these sites while desperately seeking food. Finally, after at least 72,000 people were violently killed, and with 1,000 more unaccounted for under the rubble, a ceasefire was declared in October last year. A ceasefire in name only. I say this because military operations have killed more than 650 people since then. As we enter a new phase of the ceasefire, Gaza's battered population has little cause for optimism. The future lies in the hands of the Board of Peace, an unaccountable body that the Security Council has empowered to deal with the future of Gaza. I fear that what awaits Palestinians, it's not a glossy future in the Gaza Riviera, but a state of prolonged misery in which they struggle to survive in a land that is lost to them. Beyond Gaza, the annexation of the occupied West Bank is progressing steadily. Over the last year, Israeli security operations have displaced Palestinians from camps at level not seen since 1967. Public infrastructure is systematically destroyed, so Palestinians cannot return, and the demography of camps is permanently altered. Israeli settler violence is at unprecedented level and goes largely unchecked, while settlements expand aggressively in defiance of international law. Governments across the world continue paying lip service to the two-state solution, but a political answer to the question of Palestine has never been more elusive. And now let me talk of UNRWA, as we heard from Andrew, a United Nations agency established in 1948 as a temporary stopgap measure until a political solution could be found for the Palestinian people. For decades, Israel has considered the agency a necessary evil. It disagreed with UNRWA's raison d'être, but recognized that it was key to promoting stability among Palestinian refugee communities by providing essential services. But this changed after October 7. UNRWA became an unnecessary evil. Eliminating UNRWA became an objective of the war. The Israeli government insists that Hamas is Gaza, Gaza is UNRWA, and UNRWA must therefore be Hamas. All at war. Within 2 months of the start of the war, 130 of my colleagues had been killed. On the 8th of December 23, it was only 2 months in the war, I wrote to the President of the United Nations General Assembly a letter I had never had cause to write in 35 years of working in conflicts. A letter predicting that more of my colleagues would be killed. I knew more would be killed, but not how many. The number of colleagues killed since I wrote that letter has tripled. Many died alongside their children. Many others have sustained life-changing injuries, and many were arbitrarily detained and tortured. During the siege, our staff were not spared. I received many reports of colleagues fainting from hunger while working in our clinic and shelters. And over the last 2 years, hundreds of UNRWA premises in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. The Parliament of Israel adopted legislation to end UNRWA's presence in occupied East Jerusalem, including by forcibly shutting schools and health clinics. The UNRWA headquarters was seized, looted, and set on fire, with senior Israeli officials, members of the government and the parliament, celebrating the destruction on site and online. A deputy mayor of Jerusalem called for UNRWA personnel to be annihilated. A well-orchestrated disinformation campaign alleges agency-wide neutrality breaches, including infiltration by Hamas, and claim that UNRWA is no longer operational in the occupied Palestinian territory. These malicious assertions, which have been repeatedly debunked, are intended to erode international support for UNRWA, weakening Palestinian rights within final status issues in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Looking ahead, UNRWA remains the largest, best established, most cost-effective UN humanitarian and development presence in a region in crisis. It is also a vital resource for protecting the rights of Palestinian refugees across the region and addressing the long-standing question of Palestine. Last week, I wrote again to the President of the General Assembly, and I urged Member States to leverage UNRWA's workforce and expertise as key assets for the successful implementation of Security Council Resolution 2803. This would avoid a repeat of the disastrous mistake of removing the entire civil administration in Iraq in 2003, devastating prospect for recovery and durable peace. But without immediate and robust political and financial support, UNRWA will soon reach the end of its viability. This would have immense consequences for the future right of Palestinians, as well as for an already unstable region. It is astonishing that UNRWA, a United Nations agency, has been allowed to be crushed in violation of international law with total impunity and with United Nations staff and Palestinian communities paying an unacceptable price. The gross violation of international law in conflict are not new. What is new is that these violations are no longer hidden. These violations are claimed, committed with pride, like the war trophy selfies taken by Israeli soldiers while destroying schools or while humiliating civilians in Gaza. What is new is a total sense of impunity, that rules do not apply, even if it leads to a new form of barbarism. The fact that these violations have gone unanswered has further compromised international NGOs and media in the OPT, and while undoubtedly compromised humanitarian and human rights work everywhere. The event on and after 7 October 2023 have generated seismic changes. We are living in a dangerous and unpredictable times. The abject failure to muster an effective multilateral and international law-based response in Gaza has enabled a war outside international legal boundaries that is now spreading across and beyond the Middle East. It has normalized disdain for the rule-based international order. The Geneva Convention were put in place more than 75 years ago to protect civilians and non-combatants during conflict, a set of rules on which we all agreed. But do we still? Today, the Convention are so undermined that they are at risk of becoming irrelevant. The lack of meaningful action in defense of international law is weakening the foundation of multilateralism with serious consequences. It is fueling resentment in the global south, where many perceive that the values enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in international law do not apply equally, and certainly not when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict. International humanitarian law is losing its universality by doing so. Many participants in Davos and Munich this year warned that we are experiencing a rupture of the rule-based order and that a new order is emerging. Even countries that identified as ardent defenders of international law are downplaying its weight, barely concealing that it is applied selectively depending on the accused and the victims. Our leaders in governments are not fighting back. They feel intimidated and powerless. They are failing in their responsibilities by giving into economic or military bullying and threats. We must ask ourselves how we arrived at this juncture where broadly accepted roles and shared value are so fundamentally contested. Back to Gaza. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is revealing a highly concerning deficit of mutual empathy and deeply entrenched prejudice. This attitude has been fostered over decades through competing narratives anchored in divergent beliefs about what triggered the conflict. Narratives that have often been cynically exploited to gain and maintain political power. Today, Israeli and Palestinian are neighbors who no longer know each other, divided by war and growing isolation. It is both tragic and ironic because Palestinian and Israeli share a long and profound history of oppression, grief, and loss that most of us could not begin to imagine or understand. I'm often asked how we should respond to the profound challenges confronting the rule-based international order. Is there a balance to be struck between holding firm to principle and pragmatic accommodation? While compromise is a central tenet of resolving conflicts, I believe that core principles and values cannot be negotiated. For humanitarian, our ability to provide life-saving assistance depends on strict adherence to the principles of humanity, independence, impartiality, and neutrality. We cannot, under any circumstances, be part of efforts that flout this principle by discriminating against people in need of assistance or politicizing human suffering. Wars and humanitarian crises are deeply complex. To navigate them effectively, we must maintain clarity regarding our purpose and be guided by commonly agreed principles. However, this is not enough. We also have an obligation to call out violation of human rights and international humanitarian law, even when it is inconvenient and uncomfortable, even when violations are committed by friends and allies, even when it comes at a professional and personal cost. Archbishop Desmond Tutu reminded us of the moral imperative to act against injustice when he stated that to be silent in the face of oppression is to choose the side of the oppressor. Silence is complicity. so is inaction. My colleagues at UNRWA have spoken out forcefully against the horrors and indignities that Palestinians have endured in Gaza. UNRWA has loudly and repeatedly raised the alarm regarding violation of international humanitarian law and the United Nations Charter. We have identified this violation as part of a long-standing political project to separate Palestinians from Palestine. Our information has helped to create an evidence base for the ruling of the International Court of Justice. To be vocal is a choice, and in my view, to be vocal is a duty. In conclusion, rising populism and bigotry are a threat to human rights and the rule of law, which underpin our collective security and prosperity. International solidarity around our shared values is needed now more than ever, and each of us has a role to play. The primary responsibility for addressing humanitarian challenges and political crises lies with member states, all of which are obliged to uphold international law. But where quiet diplomacy and public expression of concern and condemnation, we are very good at that, by the way, fail to influence the actions of a rogue government, alternative measures should be considered. These measures range from political, diplomatic, and economic sanction to legal action. In the context of Gaza, it is imperative that we reject attempts to undermine and marginalize the United Nations and other humanitarian actors. We must also demand a political pathway that safeguards the right of Palestinians and finally addresses the question of Palestine. There is no doubt that these are dangerous and unpredictable times, but we do not have the luxury of despair and inaction. We must act, not belatedly, but now, to mobilize a broad coalition genuinely committed to uphold international law and to defend multilateralism. We must persist in a vigorous defense of our common humanity and shared value. And maybe just on a personal note to end, I have been, over the last few years, of course, inspired by our staff in the field, but I have to say that without the support of my family, my children, who are all here, Dalva, Chiara, Annabelle, Alexander, and my wife, Antonia, I would certainly have given up a long time ago. So, thank you.